In 2019, the European Council, the heads of state of the different member states of the EU, endorsed the European Green Deal, an ambitious plan to make Europe sustainable, raising €1 trillion to invest and transition to a circular economy powered by renewable energy. But to understand the European Green Deal, we need to go back to a conference in Japan in 1997. After decades of lobbying by environmental groups, most of the developed world signed on to the first carbon reduction scheme, the Kyoto Protocol. The European Union fell under Annex I countries, which included Russia, Japan, the United States, Canada, and Australia, which were responsible for the most CO2 and had to cut back on their carbon emissions. European CO2 emissions fell by 20% between 2000 and 2017, and it was the only signatory to fulfill the conditions of the protocol, though this was in part due to a relocation of Europe's manufacturing industry to the rest of the world. Despite fulfilling its commitment, the cuts as part of their agreement were nowhere near enough, and climate conference followed climate conference with little effect. The global temperature and CO2 emissions continued to rise, and efforts to find a global solution seemed out of reach. In 2015, after years of negotiation, the world signed the Paris Climate Agreement, which saw the world pledge to try and keep the temperature rise to under 2 degrees Celsius. But despite being praised by the hosting French president at the time and the Secretary General of the United Nations, the agreement was non-binding. The world's biggest polluters were expected to cut back on emissions voluntarily. While commitments have been shaky from much of the world, with the United States withdrawing in 2019, the European Union has gone full speed ahead. The bloc has committed to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 and initially committed to cut emissions by 40% by 2030 and later increasing this amount to 55%. In 2019, they approved the European Green Deal, an ambitious plan centered around 2 transitions, which involve decarbonizing and digitalizing Europe's economy. The president of the European Commission has labeled the agreement as Europe's man on the moon moment, signaling the momentous achievement. The deal itself, however, is not legislation. Rather, it is a plan for the approaches and legislation that Europe needs to pass in order to become sustainable. The European Commission has since then published a series of strategy papers on food production, biodiversity preservation, and industrial and digitalization policy, which are all pillars of the Green Deal. It is a plan to mobilize €1 trillion in order to finance the transition, and as a result, it is the largest environmental effort in the world. But even then, some fear that it might not be enough, with estimates that the European Union might need as much as €2.8 trillion to finance the transition. And even out of all the money the EU has pledged to spend, not all of it is from the European Union itself. Only about half will come from the European Union's budget. The rest will come from its plan to mobilize private and national capital, which will be incentivized by the Green Deal through the creation of new business opportunities. Instead of being a total rewrite of the rules and redefining approaches, the European Green Deal is adding new rules on top of the existing ones, with a focus on the environmental transition. The European Union's budget has not changed that much, still amounting to roughly €1 trillion over 7 years. The total spending on areas included in the European Green Deal represents about half of the total EU budget, though the entire EU budget follows the do not harm principle laid out in the Paris Agreement. Any spending using EU financing cannot harm the environment. But when a virus emerged from China and wreaked havoc on the world economy, it prompted an EU intervention to safeguard its economy, but using the Green Deal as a guideline for during and after the COVID pandemic. After long and bitter discussions, the European Union has agreed on Next Generation EU, a €750 billion recovery package in the form of grants and loans on top of the European Green Deal. The package will be distributed to the countries most affected by the coronavirus pandemic to help them recover, but also with the intention of accelerating their transition. This will mean additional contributions to the EU budget in the coming years by member countries to finance the first debt that the European Union has ever emitted. With these additional funds, the talk of the European Green Deal has shifted to being one about the green recovery. The additional funds are required to see significant investments into climate change and the digital transition, in a similar way to the spending of the Green Deal. The Corona Recovery Package, of which the main beneficiaries are Southern European countries, serves a dual purpose. It aims to help them to cope with being the most affected by the early phases of the pandemic, and will allow them to finance their transition despite their large debt piles. While the European Green Deal aims to push Europe towards sustainability, there is no consensus on what exactly that means for both political and economic reasons. The richer, mostly Western and Northern European countries, have already started transitioning their economies, so they want the funds to be used for innovation. The poorer East wants the funds to catch up with the West in terms of technology and to invest in their economies. There is also a split within the European Union on whether or not nuclear energy and natural gas should be included in the pathway towards sustainability, mostly for the production of hydrogen and also energy. Activists have criticized the European Green Deal for involving corporate actors in its elaboration, and for being less green than it initially planned to be. 58% of the meetings of Frans Timmermans, the European Commissioner responsible for the Green Deal, were with fossil fuel industry lobbyists, which pushed for a place for natural gas and hydrogen in the green transition. One of the challenges the European Union faces is what to label as a green company. The rules for the 500 billion euros the EU is supposed to raise, and more, called green finance, are still undecided. The negotiation process will determine who will get the money and where the money will be spent in the European Union. By labeling a sector of the economy sustainable, the European Union hopes to draw funding to it from the private sector. But a study on the current draft rules found that only 1% of all German and 2% of French-listed companies, which are present on the stock market, were considered to be sustainable. The plan was then rejected by several EU countries, who want to broaden the definition of sustainability and see more companies included, despite fears that the EU's definition of sustainability might be unscientific. The European Green Deal, while first and foremost an industrial plan, acknowledges the need to preserve biodiversity through the biodiversity strategy, improve agricultural practices through the Farm to Fork initiative, and protect citizens from change through the Just Transition mechanism. The Farm to Fork strategy will serve to guide the Common Agricultural Policy, the largest source of EU spending, but it too is facing criticism. Extensive lobbying by the agricultural sector means that only a third of the funding will be used to finance sustainable investments in farming. The Just Transition mechanism, on the other hand, is a 100 billion euro tool that aims to finance the parts of Europe most hard hit by the transition, either through loss of jobs or conversion of jobs. It will serve mostly to compensate Eastern European coal miners, particularly in Poland, the Czech Republic, and Romania, which are expected to lose tens of thousands of jobs as a consequence of the transition. It hopes to alleviate the burden by providing funding to help companies reorient their activities and regions to retrain those whose jobs have gone. The European Green Deal is an ambitious plan to transform the economy, but one that does not question its fundamental basis. The fact that the deal was designed by corporations, not the people or activists, can be clearly seen within the deal. The whole idea behind the European Green Deal is to spread subsidies and investments far and wide across the economy to kickstart the industry's move towards sustainability. The EU budgetary tools, alongside the Corona recovery package, push and allow the countries under fiscal pressure from Eastern and Southern Europe to follow the transition that they would otherwise be unable to afford. This was Into Europe. Thanks for watching. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to receive the latest updates and analysis on European news.